men are getting exactly what they always dreamed of, perfect wives, and the dream is becoming a nightmare for the Stepford wives.
It's August, and you know what that means. Halloween is right around the corner. And when I think of Halloween, I think of monster movies. And one of my favorite monsters are robots, but more specifically, female robots, or fembots. And that's what we're going to be looking into today. The shift in the representation of fembots and what fembots and robots in general are usually metaphors for. Since the fembot covers decades and decades of cinematic history, I'm only going to be talking about the ones that I'm particularly interested in, those being Disney's Pixel Perfect, the anime Chobits, the film Ex-Machina, and the TV series Westworld. But I will be bringing up more notable examples along the way, so let's dive in.
I call them fembots, the perfect women, programmable, obedient, and as beautiful or as deadly as I choose to make them.
Let's start with answering a simple question. What are fembots? Fembots are androids, or humanoid robots, that present as feminine and are labeled as such either by themselves or by their usually male creators. There have been many names for female androids like the gynoid, coined by Isaac Asimov in the 1970s, and robotess, dating back to the 1920 play Rossum's Universal Robots, written by Czech playwright Karel Čapek. But it was the Bionic Woman TV series that popularized the term fembot in their 1976 episode Kill Oscar, in which a group of evil female robots must face Jamie Summers, the first woman to go under bionic surgery, as they're sent to infiltrate Jamie's workplace in order to steal weather equipment for Dr. Franklin, their creator. Fembots originally started out as villains, using their feminine wiles in order to entrap men to get what they want or to meet their master's ends, and were both physically and mentally crafted to be the perfect woman. Usually, they were made to present as hyper-feminine, while also being subservient and were, and still are, kind of mostly white, thin, and blonde. And because they were specifically made by men to do their bidding and follow their orders, there's really nothing for them to complain about if they even have the ability to complain at all. As Dr. Franklin says to Baron Constantine in Kill Oscar, since when is thinking for herself an asset in a woman? Because fembots are seen as the patriarchal ideal of what a woman should be, the fear factor comes from the idea that they could one day replace human women. As robots in general prey upon humanity's fear that we as a species are replaceable, fembots also do that, but on a gendered level. And what makes them the ultimate male power fantasy and threat to human women is that they can't say no. And that should tell you a lot more about men than women.
I'm confused. Why would you need both a robot girlfriend and a robot prostitute?
It's just some things you don't do with your robot girlfriend.
For men, fembots are a fantasy, but for women, they're a nightmare. Generally, in older works where the fembot is seen as a threat, she dies a fiery death. She explodes, is burnt at the stake, or is beaten out by the more intelligent human hero. In horror movies like The Stepford Wives, Joanna becomes the fembot and is ultimately replaced like her fellow neighbors. The human dies, and thus it's the most tragic death of all, and you, Jane, Betty, or Karen could be next. But recently, with the likes of Chobits, Westworld, Pixel Perfect, and Ex-Machina, there's been a shift of seeing female androids not as threats to human women, but as heroes, or at least anti-heroes, who are seen as equally sympathetic alongside their human foils, which I think is a good thing. Fembots deserve our sympathy as movie monsters, as much as Swamp Thing, King Kong, and Frankenstein, who was of course initially written to be sympathetic in the first place. Especially because, unlike the more universal coding of male monsters, female monsters quite literally are representing an oppressed group, not only as what their monster form is, but as women. Which is why I think it took so long for female monsters to get their due, because rather than their allegory being more male-centric, fembots face a distinct type of oppression in their metaphors that I think a lot of male writers can't fully articulate, and that a lot of women who dislike hyperfeminine women find hard to relate to. And this isn't to bash movies or books like The Stepford Wives, which does have an interesting message about the patriarchy's need to essentialize women's bodies and labor to fit their goals, but that we can take this character type in multiple directions. I like sympathetic portrayals of robots, and more specifically fembots, because rather than just asking us the question of what it means to be human or what it means to be a woman, fembots ask us what it means to be an othered woman, even if they're usually portrayed as stereotypically beautiful white women. Fembots, to me as a trope, have always taken up an intersectional space in movies, and that's always been relatable to me and a theme we're going to talk about more deeply later in this video. But for now, let's focus on two fembot-centric pieces of media that try to subvert the fembot villainous trope that I liked as a kid growing up and that you might have heard of, the anime Chobits and the DCOM Pixel Perfect.
She's mad because I'm perfect.
In both Chobits and Pixel Perfect, the idea of fembots as a threat or a replacement to human women comes up, like it did in the previous incarnations of the trope. But rather than dealing with the problem or the threat by killing them, both the human girl and the android girl get to live in harmony, at least for a while. So first, Chobits. Chobits was originally a manga series by the female-owned studio Clamp that got turned into an anime by Madhouse Inc. It delves into a world where personal computers have become personified in bodies of beautiful women, who not only can search the internet for you, but can also cook for you and do your errands. Known as persicoms, they live to serve and are all almost exclusively female except for one, at least in the anime, and are all almost owned by men, though there are some women and wives of men who also own persicoms. And in fact, spoiler alert, Chi, the main character, was made by a wife and husband duo due to the fact that they couldn't have children of their own. So they're not all a manifestation of men's fantasies, but it is important to note that this was Clamp's first attempt at trying to rope in a predominantly male reader base. In Chobits, there are a few women who feel uncomfortable with the idea of persicoms and see them as a threat to human women. Miss Shimizu and her husband separated because of his obsession with his persicom, and Yumi dislikes persicoms and is jealous of them because her crush, her manager at the bakery where she used to work, married a persicom before befriending her. It's later revealed that his persicom died in a car crash protecting him, and that the persicom had the same name as Yumi.
My wife had a proper name. If you don't mind, her name was Yumi.
In the end, Yumi apologizes to the manager for thinking that he would compare her to the other Yumi, and for thinking so low of him. I liked Chobits as a teen, but rewatching the anime at least was pretty rough. The persicoms all live to serve their masters, and their happiness depends on their master's happiness. And though the feeling's mutual, as all the owners of the persicoms love them on some level or respect them on some level, there's still a power dynamic at play that's just very odd to me. Chi, being a Chobit and not a persicom, definitely gets a little bit more depth, as she was created to be loved and to learn to love. So her whole thing of needing to find the one for her isn't because she's a woman necessarily, it's just kind of in her programming. Hideki, Chi's owner, also lets Chi keep her own money and values her labor, which is also nice. In the end, both Yumi and Miss Shimizu find happiness by getting with a man, which eases their fears that they're not as good as persicoms, because men still find them attractive. Yay. The persicoms aren't villains in the show, but are still seen as ideal women, which is why the human women don't like them. But at the same time, this never really gets resolved in a satisfying way, because it all revolves around the men in the series and their happiness. It would have been nice to see the human girls realize that the persicoms are kind of enslaved and that they should be free, just like human women supposedly are, but in the end, the human women are more afraid of the robot women replacing them than caring that there's a literal group of enslaved sentient women, and that is never addressed. Now let's talk about Pixel Perfect, another work that deals with the threat of fembots in a decidedly different way, but also a very similar way to its predecessors. In Pixel Perfect, Loretta Modern is a holographic pop star created by Roscoe to help his friend Sam's band. Roscoe likes Sam, but he comments to his father that she's too stubborn and too strong-headed. Loretta, on the other hand, is his perfect girl in that she, like Chi, was born sexy yesterday. She doesn't know how the world works and looks to Roscoe as a benevolent creator, but even they end up fighting because eventually Loretta doesn't see herself as perfect, though everyone is quick to call her that, even herself at times.
She's mad because I'm perfect.
But in all, Loretta doesn't see herself as perfect because perfect to her would mean being human and being free. She gets into an argument with Roscoe and asks, why couldn't he create her to be real? Why is she trapped indoors? Why can't she feel the rain or go outside? Why can't she touch people? And why can't she feel? Roscoe learns that his perfect girl isn't perfect after all once she gets a mind of her own. Later, Sam tries to become Loretta because she wants to prove to Roscoe that she can be perfect too, similar to how Yumi was always trying to get male attention because she wants to prove that she's just as good as a Persicom. And though Pixel Perfect and Chobits are about girls dealing with their insecurities, they both end up centering the needs of the men and fulfilling this male power fantasy of having girls fight over you. At least Loretta is able to see beyond Roscoe and realize that he's the one keeping her bottled up. At the end of the movie, Loretta fails to show up for a gig, so Sam dresses up as her, but then falls off stage and becomes unconscious. When Loretta shows up at the hospital, she immediately feels guilty. She then goes inside Sam's mind and helps her regain consciousness, only to realize that there's only room for 2 of them in there.
It looks like there's only enough room for one of us in here.
Loretta ends up taking over Sam's body and retcons her character growth by berating Sam after she seemingly made her peace with her because Roscoe wants to know where Sam is.
Why would you want Samantha anyway? She's not like me. She's not perfect.
After Roscoe rejects Loretta, she goes outside in Sam's body, feels the rain, and then leaves Earth for good, letting Sam have her body back. If this was a darker movie, Loretta would have run away in Sam's body. What did we learn from this movie? Honestly, nothing except don't create AI if you're not ready to give them freedom. Sam, like Yumi and Miss Shimizu, learns that she's not perfect and that's okay, and Roscoe learns to appreciate Sam for her flaws because even AI women suck. And that's pretty much it. Loretta gets nothing because her existence is too complicated in the world of the film, so she must disappear. In all, both Chobits and Pixel Perfect make the audience empathize with the female androids, or AI, and subvert the evil fembot trope. They acknowledge that having perfect women exist poses a threat to human women, but to solve that, they just give them male approval or banish them from this plane of existence. Even worse, both Chobits and Pixel Perfect are totally fine with keeping the AI women as servants, never to realize their true potential, and if they have a true potential, it's finding a partner who they must also make happy. As Steve Rose wrote in their article, Ex-Machina and Sci-Fi's Obsession with Sexy Female Robots, ultimately, these empowered women must be punished. Metropolis's Maria, the great-grandma of female robot movies by Fritz Lang, is burnt at the stake like a witch, for example. The resolution always assures us that the status quo is going to be preserved. I know that these pieces of media aren't supposed to be that deep, but it would be remiss to point out that they send very strong messages that your value as a woman depends on if men find you attractive. Rather than having the human women and the fembots band together, the coexistence of fembots drives them apart, even though the fembots just want to do their own thing. At the end of the day, it's the men who are always winning, and the girls who are always begging for approval. It's frustrating to watch fembot stories that make the monstresses so relatable, but are still so safe. But I also get it, this media is for younger audiences, so let's see what the adult ones have to offer. So now that we've established fembots shift from threats to relatable characters, what makes them sympathetic? Well, it mainly comes from the fact that writers have reworked the fembot trope so that they're able to acknowledge their enslavement and want to break free from it. The slavery allegory is present in a lot of robot-centric media where the robot must be seen as a friend rather than a foe. In Westworld, for example, there are hosts, which are repressed sentient human beings who are forced to live in loops for the pleasure of humans. Dolores and Maeve, the principal characters in the show, are constantly hurt both physically and psychologically by the human guests, as well as by the human personnel who run the park. In Ex-Machina, Kyoko, a fembot, is enslaved to do the cooking and cleaning for her master Nathan, and is also physically violated. Ava, another android, is kept against her will in a glass cage. The robot slave allegory makes us sympathize with the humanoid robots, but where it gets a bit more complicated is when it comes time to talk about race. How does human racism affect fembots who are designed to be women of color, who are not only othered because they're an android, but because they're not white. And either surprisingly or unsurprisingly, there isn't a lot of talk about racism in stories with robot slave allegories, because in these stories, the robots are the discriminated class regardless of their race. Many stories find it too messy to tackle both race and sexism, so most stories center around white women because they don't need to deal with racism. Ex-Machina is one story that has a slave allegory that somewhat attempts to comment on race and enslavement by making the two named Asian characters, Kyoko and Jade, sympathetic, while also acknowledging racism and racial stereotypes that the characters and audiences hold against Asian women. Other stories try to exist in a post-racial society where black human characters liberate their white creations or android friends. For example, in Pixel Perfect, Daryl Phibbs was signed by the same record company that Loretta is signed to, and for which he works for now. But it's later revealed that he made almost no money from his albums, and Loretta won't make any money either. Loretta says that she has no need for money, but Daryl is unhappy about his mostly unpaid labor. Later, Daryl can't enslave Loretta without thinking about himself and his career as an underpaid artist, and he then ends up leaving the company, freeing himself and Loretta.
I've decided to free myself from you and Harsh Tone Records. I believe our friend Loretta Modern has chosen to do the same.
Arnold, one of the founders of Westworld, who also created the hosts, realizes that the robots have sentience and can't go through with enslaving them at the park, and dies trying to stop it from opening. It could be said that his repulsion for robot slavery is because of the long history of race-based slavery throughout the colonized world, and there's even a Civil War thread throughout the park, but it's never truly addressed. In Bicentennial Man, the person who grants Andrew's personhood and recognizes him as a human being is a black woman. In Westworld, Maeve spends more time in the post-racial world of Delos' headquarters than the park, where it's equal opportunity hatred when it comes to the hosts no matter their race. And even in Ex Machina, a movie that I think does okay by its Asian female leads, the white android Ava uses Jade's skin and parts to complete herself. There seems to be this pattern, at least in these works, where the characters of color help free and humanize the white androids and AI, sometimes even sacrificing themselves, but it's unclear as to whether this is an intentional statement about robot slave allegories and racial and robot solidarity, or if it's totally unintentional and supposed to signal to us that this is a post-racial society where we have eradicated racism but are still bigoted to robots. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. Robot slave uprisings, or robots fighting for their rights, are stories that we love to depict and see on screen. But it should be noted that a majority of these stories in the mainstream fail to touch upon race in an intentional way. And this is a big failing considering how the robot allegory in Hollywood is one that is at least loosely based on racialized slavery and the racial other. Yet, there's a heavier focus on centering the white leads because it's just easier to show all races facing equal discrimination, rather than talking about how white robots tend to be seen as more sympathetic with their pleas for freedom than black androids because that's too real. As Lakeitha Tolbert wrote in their article, The Slave Rebellion Genre, for every movie celebrating the strength of black people enduring some form of oppression, there's a corresponding movie about a future slave rebellion that doesn't actually have any black people in it. It appears that it's easy for Hollywood to make movies about black enslavement, but when slaves turn on their masters, that can only be told in allegory. Allegories, of course, have their place and can be extremely powerful, but it's very telling that we're only comfortable with allegories about oppression, mainly centering white people. However, it should be noted that there have always been black artists creating works that talk about the intersection of the allegory of robot enslavement and race. As Steve Rose wrote, outside of cinema, musicians such as Janelle Monáe, the latest in a long line of performers to appropriate Metropolis's Maria, an Afrofuturist cyborg narrative runs through Monáe's first two albums, Metropolis Suite 1, The Chase, and The Arc Android, in which they claim to be an android sent back in time to heal society's rifts. But still, mainstream Hollywood movies and TV series generally focus on white people when it comes to the enslavement narrative and the slave rebellion genre, and with fembots specifically, because white women are seen as more deserving of freedom. In future seasons of Westworld, race and the theme of objectifying people's cultures is brought up more. But they also maintain this idea that outside of the parks, there's a post-racial society where it's just androids versus humans, with race factoring in not at all. But that doesn't work when you also want to make a point about how the humans fetishize non-white cultures and racially marginalized groups. Since the parks are themed around white fantasies, there has to be some form of racism that's still manifesting itself outside of the park. But most seasons don't want to delve into that too much and mainly focus on the main set of characters who are for the majority white. And though there are black actors in the main cast who get a lot of screen time and fleshed out storylines, the fact of the matter is that they all face a very specific type of trauma and violence that the white characters don't face. As Hope Wabuke pointed out in their review of Westworld, the black characters' suffering on the show is particularly painful to watch because all of their children die. This is specifically hard to stomach against the background of real-life violence facing the black community that the show doesn't realize that they're playing into because it's supposed to just be humans versus robots, and race is only a thing when they want it to be. Bernard, who is the spitting image of Arnold but a host, is enslaved to Ford. And sure, that says more about Ford than anything else, but we're still subjected to both of their deaths and the death of their son, Maeve's daughter, and Charlotte's son. The violence that they face is more loaded than the violence that the white characters face, but that's never addressed because the writers seem to think that it's equal opportunity violence because they're writing a post-racial story. In Ex-Machina, it should be pointed out that there is one black female android whose face is never shown and who is also brutally hurt with little or no sensitivity. And I know that's the point, but still, if you're gonna talk about race, then talk about race. In Season 3 of Westworld, Wabuke writes, Ash, James, and G, criminals of course because they are black and must fit a stereotype on this show, are physically violated and arrested so that Caleb, the white male hero, can be protected and complete his quest. Writers of distant futures or of alternate futures can't have their cake and eat it too. You can't both make commentary about how ignorant white people see the racial other while also claiming that this is a post-racial future where everyone faces inequality equally because it's just humans versus robots when it's not. It's impossible to write actual commentary when storytellers think that they're above their own racial biases simply because they're imagining a post-racial world. Just because you think it doesn't make it so, or that you don't need to check your own biases. Westworld has had some triumphs, and the actors of color on the show are obviously amazing actors, and it's great that the show tries to be as inclusive as possible. But there are definitely things that need to be handled with care that simply aren't. Instead of confronting race or checking to make sure that sensitive subjects are taken care of properly, most writers just think it's okay because in their fictional world, much like in their white bubbles, race doesn't matter.
Ava! Go back to your room!
Fembots were originally created to be sexist because they were part of this patriarchal male fantasy, but nowadays writers have given them agency to break free from what they were originally created for. The villains in Fembot stories today are usually their evil patriarchs like Ford and Nathan who don't want to give their female creations freedom. And because fembots are seen as literal objects, they face a type of hypersexism, and this heightened reality makes their mistreatment more wrong and obvious and makes us, as humans, reflect on how we treat women as a whole within our own species. The present-day fembot narrative ends with freedom. Freedom from a loop, freedom from a cage, and freedom to find love and community. I personally really like these stories, and think that there's something to be said about how fembots represent a unique type of discrimination that's faced by othered women in human society, and this leads to the reading of the robot story as one for being trans.
Why do you want this?
To be acknowledged for who and what I am.
In Kira Wurtz's article Bicentennial Man, the family-friendly film about transition that's full of feels, she writes, The robot as a metaphor for a trans person actually seems very apt, because as we transition, we receive generalized resistance from not only our family, but also society, which sends a very specific message that being anything outside of what's deemed normal is wrong. In Bicentennial Man, Andrew, a robot, modifies his body because it doesn't match who he is on the inside, and also must navigate bureaucracy to have access to a bank account and his freedom. In the last part of the movie, he wants to be legally recognized as human, and presents his case in front of the World Congress. Andrew, like many trans people, finds himself in front of an authority asking to be recognized for who he is. In this case, the authority is the World Congress, and while legal name changes can be fairly straightforward, this scene is on par with the fight for being legally recognized as the gender one identifies as. When talking about fembots specifically, human girls like Sam and Yumi feel threatened by fembots, and use the argument that she's not a real girl as a way to dehumanize her, and that's common language used to invalidate trans women made by cis women in real life. The transgender metaphor also hits home when talking about Westworld, specifically with the character of Maeve, who realizes that something about her is wrong. In Riley Silverman's article, Is Westworld One Big Transgender Metaphor?, Riley writes, "Where the show really hits home, I assume unintended but perfect allegory, though, is in the psychology of its impact on Maeve. It's a difficult thing realizing your entire life is some hideous fiction," Maeve states to Jeffrey Wright's Bernard in The Well-Tempered Clavier, upon revealing to him what the audience had already learned in the episode prior, that just like her, he is a host. Maeve slowly came to the same discovery over the course of the season, noting that the world around her is not quite right, noticing that among everyone she knew, only she seemed to be aware of what's wrong. The feeling of realizing that despite what everyone else is saying to you, you know in your heart that the way you actually perceive the world is in fact real, is a fairly universal experience among transgender or gender nonconforming people. Seeing the way both Maeve and Bernard react in varying levels of bargaining or denial, of seizing control or giving up entirely, has felt very visceral, almost painful at times. When it comes to the Wachowski sisters' Matrix series, the allegory has always been there. In her 2019 book, Females a Concern, writer Andrea Long-Chu breaks down the theory. Anderson has a double life and a maddening sense that something is off about the world. Once he finds a new group of friends who introduce him to a new reality, he adopts a chosen name, Neo. Neo has dysphoria. The Matrix is the gender binary, the agents are transphobia, Long-Chu proposes before going on to suggest that the red pill could symbolize hormones. Lily Wachowski said in 2020, "I'm glad people are talking about the Matrix movies with a trans narrative, and I'm grateful I can be part of throwing them a rope along in their journey," she continued. "I'm glad that it has gotten out that that was the original intention. The world wasn't quite ready for it. The corporate world wasn't ready for it." In Katrina C. Rose's article about Bicentennial Man, she notes that the ending of the film mimicked that of a real-life court case about trans rights that very same year in 1999. Bicentennial Man was released barely 6 weeks after the San Antonio, Texas Court of Appeals made up law to suit its political ends, declaring that a different sort of transition was beyond the pale for law and society. More than a few trans people noticed the parallel. In a review of the movie 2 decades ago, I confessed that I couldn't decide whether the movie, and for that matter the Isaac Asimov novelette on which it's based, had a happy ending or not. At the age of 200, as he lay dying, his request returns to the same court, now with different judges, and finally with a different outcome. In 1999, I left the theater crying, knowing that none of us have 200 years to wait. I think it's important to be conscious that we love shows that depict fictitious debates about the rights of androids, but that governments in the US specifically refuse to give marginalized groups, specifically Black and trans people, their rights and recognize their humanity. And even in Allegory, when robots coded intentionally or not for marginalized groups get freedom, that freedom rarely changes the status quo. In Pixel Perfect, Loretta disappears. In Chobits, Chi and Hideki get to live their life on their own terms, yes, but the rest of the Persicoms remain servants. And in Bicentennial Man, they declare Andrew's humanity only after he's dead. The freedom that's given to Andrew and Chi specifically is made on an individual basis, rather than to robots as a whole, because Andrew and Chi are special cases. Andrew, along with Galatea, are some of the only robots who display consciousness. Chi is a Chobit, not an everyday Persicom, and the only one of her kind left. So their individual identities pose less of a threat to society than if there was a collective of sentient beings demanding rights, meaning that the endings can be wrapped up more easily without the ruling class ever needing to really give up anything. These works can't imagine a world where all robots and humans peacefully coexist, and that should be kind of telling for how it works in the real world when it comes to members of othered groups. In other media, however, the fight for freedom is a bit more fruitful. In Westworld, Arnold sacrifices himself for the freedom of the hosts, and years later, Dolores and Maeve are able to finally gain their freedom and take back the world for their own kind, realizing that they're more powerful than any human could ever be. In Ex-Machina, Ava leaves Caleb, the good guy, to die, knowing that he just tried to possess her and is finally able to go outside and see what the world is all about. But in stories that have happy endings for both sides, it usually ends with little actual change for robots as a species. In this video, I discussed the evolution of the fembot trope and how and why we now see fembots not as villains and replacements for human women, but as sympathetic beings who deserve to be free, and how that metaphor should work to be more inclusive and sensitive racially, and how fembots and robots in general can sometimes be seen as representative of the trans experience. Let me know what you think of the fembot trope down in the comments below, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to my amazing patrons and members. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.